We're back. This is Previously on Pod, and I'm Gracie. We talk all things nostalgia TV here, and today we are going to talk about nostalgia TV shows and documentary style filming. Think Friday Night Lights, The Office, Parks and Recreation, Shaky Cam, Personal Interview, and overall how a comedy or a drama in the 2010s, let's say 2000s to 2010s, was shaped by this unique style. So here's what I'm thinking. So Friday Night Lights is one of my very favorite shows. So I definitely want to spend more time on this because I also love shows like The Office, and I think it's just as genius to use documentary style for comedy. However, I think there's something just more moving about using it for drama, and I'll talk about why. So I think, this realism that's incorporated in all of these shows just shows itself really differently, right? So, for example, in something like Parks and Rec or The Office, there are probably other examples that I'm missing, but we're going to work with the 3 shows that I've seen because that's what I'm going to do. But I'd be really interested to hear what other ones that I'm just totally blanking on. With shows like this, I would argue that the dialogue is not really meant to represent as sort of realism. I think it can, right? There's this sort of sometimes offbeat quality about it. And sometimes maybe that registers like real life. A lot of improv in these shows, right? A show like New Girl is the same. Obviously, camera-wise, is it a multicam? But super improv in terms of the dialogue. And so I think there's probably a lot of that in these other shows. But I think it's kind of the comedy aspect of it really overrides the realism. You know what I mean? It's supposed to be almost like a skit, which is so fun and awesome to watch and very different from like a sitcom. But I don't know if it captures exactly the realism that really appeals to me. So we'll get back to that. Whereas Friday Night Lights, which is the show I most want to touch on, I think uses dialogue in a really unique way. I love it. I really would like to emulate it just in my own writing when I think about watching an episode of Friday Night Lights. So much goes into it feeling realistic. I'm thinking about My So-Called Life, which kind of started that darker, grainier, realistic look to high school. I'm sure Friday Night Lights was pulling on that when they were setting up a lot of their shots. The lighting is just way more realistic. Of course, they have drop-dead gorgeous adult models playing teenagers, so that's where the realism ends. However, I do think the shots themselves just capture small town in an awesome way that just really never gets old. I just love it. I think that the dialogue feels so real. There's hardly ever a moment where a character says something and I'm like, ooh, that was really forced in there for the storyline. It was really out of character. It was kind of awkward. They just do such a good job with it, and I love it. I think on rewatching a few episodes of Friday Night Lights, one thing that I took for granted in the show was how much the shaky cam really plays into what we're getting from as a viewer. I think there's a vulnerability that the characters are able to imbue to us as the audience without even saying much, and I think it comes from that shaky cam. There's a awkwardness, just a lack of presentation or performance. It's they're performing, but it doesn't feel like a performance because of sometimes the way that the camera moves around or doesn't capture them quite in the right way, and it feels very organic. Whereas I feel like in a show like The Office, you're very much supposed to know that the camera, it's almost like you're being let in on the script. There's still a script. The cameraman is still panning at all the right moments, but you're being let in on it, and that's why it's funny. And Friday Night Lights, there's not a cameraman, right? It's truly supposed to just be real life. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. Whereas I guess I haven't seen all of Parks and Recreation. It doesn't seem like there's supposed to be a cameraman there either, but it feels like it mimics The Office more in some of the humor that the camera provides rather than again, a super unscripted moment. in the football scenes especially, I'm going to take a break to eat because I'm really hungry. In the football scenes especially, I've noticed that the camera becomes really important. In my memory, I was like, oh yeah, the relationships and the dialogue of the show is super strong, but the kind of whole plot, might be a little flimsy with the full football concept, and like feels like it would be playing on these very basic ideas of like every episode formulaically, there's a football scene and they only cut to the most exciting moments and this or that. Sure, there's some of that, but it was actually way more nuanced when I was rewatching. That shaky cam becomes really important. It was almost reminding me of the Hunger Games. It wasn't making me as nauseous as those shots sometimes make me, but I think it's meant to represent sort of the, often, at least at the beginning of the first season, which is what I was rewatching, the chaos of football. And it was less like the glamorous football shots that I thought would be there. I think the reputation of the show in some ways was that it was for girls and, hot football players. They would watch it so that they could, just move the storyline along. It's not really about football. I'm sure that's very much true. Watching regular football and watching Friday Night Lights is a very different experience. However, I do think they're capturing a lot more than just plot with the camera work. I think it's meant to convey a lot of like emotion within the game and not just, again, like an idea of football. I do think they really are representing a deeper version of football, even if it's not always the most realistic. I think that's really cool. I think where the dialogue comes in and some of the more vulnerable camera shots, shall we say, I think it just really, really serves character. And character is like probably the most important thing to me when I'm watching a show. I don't care about plot. I don't care about football. I don't care if it's this or that. Really doesn't matter. I'll watch anything if they've got good characters, which is why I love The White Lotus, because it's all characters and really nothing else. Really no deeper meaning in a lot of ways. So I think what Friday Night Lights has captured that I've really not seen a whole lot else. Caveat, I don't really watch like quote unquote prestige TV. I just love coming of age stories. That's why I do a lot of nostalgia shows, because a lot of nostalgia TV is coming of age, right? Those are shows that a lot of people grew up watching. And because of that, I'm sure there are really nuanced portrayals in other TV shows of vulnerable characters, from character work to dialogue to acting, that I just haven't seen. And so that's on me. I should probably watch more of those shows. But I also think it is unique to highlight it in a coming-of-age story. Friday Night Lights is an interesting example because it doesn't always feel coming of age. The character's at least 26, so that's part of it. Also, one thing that I remember reading from Freaks, Gleeks, and Dawson's Creek, that book that I always reference, one thing I remember reading is there was this kind of tagline, like how Coach Taylor won Emmys. I remember reading about this concept and immediately being like, oh, I need to make a video about that. So I think another time I'd like to talk about kind of what it means to have adult characters playing kids, for one, in Friday Night Lights, and also what it means to have our main character, in a way, be an adult in a show about teenagers. I think Coach Taylor, that dynamic is really strong. I'm also biased. I love Kyle Chandler. But I think that changed the dynamic of the show and allowed the shows to win a lot of awards that it otherwise wouldn't have been privy to if it was just a show about teenage football players. So I think there's that. Another time, I also really want to make a video about Texas Forever, because I think there's just a really interesting discourse. I'm curious how this has evolved. I don't really hear many people talking about the TV show anyways, but I feel like collectively 10, 20 years ago, there was this idea of like the quaint small town that was really idyllic. And I think the show continues to me, deliver on that. Even as times have changed, I still see, the good and the bad that I think it highlights about a Texas small town. However, I feel like to the general population, I don't really consider myself in that group just because I have lived in Texas, not really in rural Texas, I suppose. But I don't know. I feel like I know it more than maybe somebody who has never stepped foot there. I feel like the general consensus on an idyllic small town in Texas has really changed. And the show, that is kind of a backbone of the show, is that you're supposed to root for the characters and see them as heroes because of their kind of small town mentality. And I just feel like I'd be really interested in doing a video seeing if I could like search around for people's, critical opinions and see if that's changed on a rewatch. I'm sure so many just cultural, social things have changed in the last 20 years that would impact the show, but I think in a lot of ways it does still hold up. And so we'll talk about that a different time. But as of right now, I want to talk about our characters. I want to talk about Matt Saracen. He was always my favorite character to watch. Coach Taylor's probably my favorite character. But I think Matt Saracen is captivating for a lot of different reasons. And I think vulnerability is really the key to all of our characters now that I'm thinking about it. Like, you think of a character like Julie, who gets a lot of screen time, maybe as much screen time as somebody like Tyra. I'm sure most people do not like Julie, and most people like Tyra. And here's why. I think she doesn't really get a lot of vulnerability in her character growth. I think she's honestly used a lot as a plot device. I think she's a plot device for Matt's character, for Coach and Tammy, even for Tyra. I don't think her story really makes sense separate of any of those characters, whereas any of those characters have a story separate from her. I think that ends up mattering a lot because we don't see her being vulnerable. We see her being selfish a lot of the times without knowing why. Whereas when we see Matt make bad decisions, we know why. Same with Tyra. Same thing when we don't really see Coach and Tammy make too many bad decisions, I'll be honest. They're pretty pure and lovely, which I think is sweet in its own right. That'd be a fun video to make, like talking about parents or best couple. They'd be a great contender. However, we get to see their flaws. Whereas for Julie, I wouldn't say we get to see her flaws. I would just say we get to see her reactions in other people's stories, and it ends up making her a pretty shallow character that I don't think is a really great one, unfortunately. However, I love Matt and Julie's relationship, and I think that is a really interesting idea that, you would think you would only like a relationship in a show if you really loved both characters, but that's just not the case. The dynamic there is just really compelling. In the video where I talk about Friday Night Lights and adulthood, you just can't do it without touching on the weirdness of Matt Saracen's character being 26 and Julie's character being 16 in real life. So the chemistry was not anything romantic between the two of them in real life. Rather, what they were able to portray on screen, I think, was like a real innocence, which I think is really cool because, one, I'm sure it was a little bit awkward. So I think conveying like an innocent kind of relationship maybe could have been the best they could do, right? Maybe it was possible that was all you could really do with such a odd age gap. Or, I'm sure it was just written that way, right? Matt's character is meant to be kind of a departure from your typical football jock life, where we get Tim Riggins having the complete opposite experience, right? Like, he's very suave and very worldly and all of these things, but still extremely vulnerable. We get the same amount of vulnerability from both of them, if not more, from Tim Riggins' character, and I think that's why he's a lot of people's favorites. We really see a cool arc with him. But I've always been partial to Matt Saracen because I think he's a more unique character. I think the, hot bad boy character has been done a lot, and I really like the way they do it with Tim Riggins, but they almost make him into like a martyr, right? Towards the end, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but he like goes to jail for his brother. He kind of gives up other people for their good. His relationship with Lila is really interesting. Again, a bit of a spoiler, but their relationship doesn't work, and he doesn't hang on to her. He ends up going back to the person who is a better fit for him, which is Tyra, and I think that's a really cool ending. So we get a big closed book on his chapter. Matt Saracen's chapter, again, I think leaves a little bit to be desired. I like that he, again, spoiler, gets married to Julie. I think that's sweet. However, I think their story is a little bit half-baked. He gets a pretty good arc with like running away from home and trying to figure out what exactly he wants outside of pleasing the other people in his life. And that's kind of the whole crux of his story. He starts off this sweetheart living with his grandma. It's almost laughable how much of a sweetie little caricature he is. And so in some ways it'd be like, oh, that's bad writing, right? Like, he's just too sweet. But I think they do a nice job balancing it because his dialogue is so sparse. I mean, he rarely talks. And I think this act of realism, I think is an intentional choice by the writers, is actually so incredible. And they use it with Coach Taylor too. Doesn't talk a lot. If he were to talk too much, he might seem too much like a big old hero who never missteps. But because he doesn't talk a lot and he lets his actions speak, I almost feel like it balances out some of the caricaturish, heroic nature of these male characters. And I feel like you could say that for almost all of them. Whereas, in contrast, somebody like Buddy Garrity is meant to be funny, and not someone with an intense amount of integrity. Character like Landry is meant to be funny. I wouldn't say he's meant to lack integrity in the same way that Buddy Garrity is. I do think he gets a nice storyline development, a good amount of vulnerability. But he's not really meant to be a hero, and neither is Buddy Garrity, right? Our heroes are more Matt and Coach Taylor. They kind of always are the ones with the decision in their hands. And even while the show subverts that in some ways, I would say that that's a crux to the show, right? Is that our football players are leaders, and that is weirdly just so basic that, again, it feels like that would be bad writing. Like when you hear the plot to this show, it just seems so done to death. Yet something about the way that it's portrayed, kind of the nervousness of Matt. I remember being so captivated that first scene where, I think it's in the pilot, or maybe I think it might be episode 2, comes out of nowhere. We've never seen them talk before. We see, all these high schoolers navigating around. We're following all these different characters. We don't yet know who knows who or how close they are. We just see Matt offer like vegan or gluten-free pancakes to Julie. Oh, Julie, I got these for you. And she says, yeah, no, I'm leaving. I don't want them. Like immediately like, okay, what? But it's so sweet, right? He's all nervous. He's handing her over these pancakes. It feels like such a human moment. And it didn't feel like a moment that was like fully scripted to be like, here's the start of their relationship. Even though it didn't feel like that because we follow along in a documentary lots of different characters. So maybe that's another point to touch on, how many main characters we have. This is hard to pull off. I certainly think, my opinion is somewhat formed by the fact that I've seen all the seasons. It's been a long time. I don't really rewatch any of the later ones because they're all new characters. And season 2, if you know, the murder plot is a little rough. So I mostly just love watching season 1 and then just maybe random episodes here or there. I just love it. I love the atmosphere of the show. I mean, oh my goodness, it's just so lovely. And it's not because it's pretty, right? They're filming in like just fast food joints and just random small town environment. Their clothes are so 2000s. They're so ugly. Oh gosh, their clothes are ugly. Take a moment to talk about that. Their clothes are ugly. But there's something that feels really atmospheric and comforting about the show to me. And I don't think it has to do with small town Texas, because I felt that, and I watched the show even before I'd ever really spent much time. I guess I have family there, but you know what I mean? Before I'd ever lived there or really had an idea of Texas being similar to that show. I think it just feels comforting because there's like a certain sense, I think, not really of even the characters all knowing each other. It's not like, oh, when I see Buddy Garrity randomly having a conversation with Tim Riggins, I'm like, oh, such a small town. They're all friends. Like, that's not really what it is. I feel like it's more this idea that as the viewer, I get to be friends with all of them, right? Like when you think of a traditional kind of just a different example, like Harry Potter, for example. I feel close with Harry, Ron, and Hermione, but I don't necessarily feel like I'm a part of Hogwarts. Maybe some people do because, again, they've just gone so much into that world of the books and the movies and all these things. But when I'm reading it, I don't really feel a part of it. I just kind of feel a part of their storyline. Whereas I think a strength of Friday Night Lights, because they spent so much time making the atmosphere realistic, that when we bounce around to all these characters, it's like we're getting a little tiny bit of all of that atmosphere put together. I feel like that feels a lot more reminiscent of real life than just always tracking with these couple people. So in a way, I feel like the story becomes more clear and it has more of an overarching point than just football, than if we were just following one jock and his, dream of victory and glory. And again, the show is absolutely meant to subvert that in episode 1. Jason Street, in his horrible injury in episode 1, is supposed to say this is not the story of the football jock who wins the state championship. And yet our whole season is about football jocks who are trying to win the state championship. I think that's just the real part of life, is that both of those things can be true. You can have a dream and pursue that dream, and yet that dream coming true is never really what the story was about. I want to talk a little bit more about the romantic relationships, because this is a focal point of the show. It's a coming of age show. It's about learning identity and a part of picking and choosing who your people are. I think a really sweet moment, because I'm such a Matt and Julie fan, there are a couple that come to mind. One is their first kiss on the football field when it's super muddy and rainy, and, you know, they just run into each other's arms, and it's this picture perfect moment, except it's not, because it's like everything's all messy. But it's, you know, it's a Kodak camera scripted TV show kind of a moment. And I love it because what follows that is just this awesome scene by the lockers at school. And it's like Matt in a bumbling mess. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. I probably made you uncomfortable. Da 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 da. Right? It's kind of like fully walking back on this really picturesque type of moment. This moment with so much finality and so much, again, like, this is the start of their relationship. And that's just not real life, right? And I love that they have this dynamic, because I think it endears us to him as being like, oh, I've been there. I've been confused, and I'm, you know, innocent, and all of these things. But it also, leaves room for the unexpected. Like, I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen next. I feel that a lot in that watching this show, which is hard to believe, because, again, in some ways it's a pretty stereotypical storyline, and yet the characters feel so much more like real people. I don't know how they quite did it. I mean, down to all the characters. I'm thinking of, like, Smash's mom. She's a super important character in the show, and yet when you look at it on paper, it just, there's so many ways, in almost every other way you could have written the show, she could have just been a throwaway character. But I think throughout the season she becomes really important, and there's just something human there. I really think goes back to the dialogue, the camera work, that documentary style that is really special. Yeah, there's just nothing else that I've seen that's quite like it. Documentary style is interesting because, again, I'm thinking about the beginning of this video where we talked about, you know, The Office and Parks and Rec and these other shows that feel very poking at realism, let's say. You know, they're not actually realistic, but they're trying to evoke that in us. And I think maybe the absurdity and the humor and the awkwardness of real life is what's evoked in those comedies, whereas the vulnerability, it seems like what's really tied to Friday Night Lights, and it just allows for such amazing characters regardless of your plot. And I think that's why it stood the test of time. I mean, there's really no other reason. It's a TV show based off a book that was based off of a real life town, and the show is nothing like the book. Similar to The Office, which was a remake of a British show. Like, there's just no reason why it had to be that good. There's just no reason. It feels like the writing is the only thing you can point to, and just some of the creative decisions that they made to stand out from other shows at that time. And I'm really interested in, again, dissecting that realism, because in some ways, you know, again, everyone's in their 20s and picture perfect beautiful. And so that is an odd choice, and that feels very 2000s in terms of, you know, a decision made by casting. I think there's a way in which the show could have been really cool had the casting been more realistic. But, I mean, it is a bit of a weird tension in the show that it is kind of supposed to be a sort of hero's journey for Coach Taylor. And yes, it's subverting that, but I don't think its goal is to subvert it. I think that's just one of the elements and quirks of the show along the way. I think it's just meant to show a new, modern, updated version of, you know, what it means to be a man, what it means to be part of a community, what it means to be a part of a sport, all of these kind of very traditional ideas that don't feel groundbreaking. I think it does it in a way that I think is still really unique and meaningful, especially as someone who doesn't really relate to a lot of those ideas. Like, I don't live in a small town, don't play football, I'm not a man. I still find the show has like that human touch to it. So I'm really curious if anyone has any thoughts on the writing and what exactly about the realism of these shows, really speaks to you? Is it the vulnerability? Is it the awkwardness? Does it all come back to dialogue? Does it come back to camera work? Is it, kind of the writing and the character arcs? I think those are super important in all of these shows as well. Yeah, I'm curious. I feel like it's more the former. It's more those earlier things. But either way, I mean, these are some of my favorite shows, and Friday Night Lights might take the cake as my favorite show. There's hardly a show that I can think that makes me feel the way that one does. And of course, that's nostalgia TV, right? That's what we're all about. A lot of it. It's not like we're critiquing greatness here. It's more just like picking apart what it is to love something and feel so comforted and so seen by something that is, crafted and scripted and put together as a narrative, but it makes you feel like so much more than that. I think that's what it's all about. So yeah, I loved talking about this topic. I'm definitely going to make more videos in the vein of Friday Night Lights, but let me know if you'd be interested in any other type of video about that show or even any of the comedies that I previously mentioned. Yeah, thanks for watching.